let's get started. So I want to welcome everyone here in person and those of you who are watching through the live stream. This panel is going to tackle property taxes. So it's titled Property Tax Puzzle, Getting from Reform to Relief. For several sessions, the legislature has done a tremendous job of sending relief back to our local governments. But before the ink is even dry on these relief bills, it seems like local governments are spending out of control, and so relief never sticks, and so taxpayers never feel that relief. One thing we're seeing is local government debt is exploding. In fact, my colleague James Quintero in a recent report said that as much as $552 billion of local government debt exists here in Texas. So we're going to walk through how we go from relief to reform to ensure that those tax dollars are seen, or that property tax relief is actually seen by taxpayers. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists here today. I'm going to start with Senator Hinojosa here to my left. So Senator Hinojosa was elected to the Texas Senate in 2024, making history as the first Republican to represent District 27 since Reconstruction. His district is home to major economic assets such as SpaceX, the ports of Brownsville and Corpus Christi, vital oil and gas infrastructure, and expansive agricultural operations that contribute to the strength of the Texas economy. In addition to his work in public service, Senator Hinojosa is a dedicated small business owner, working alongside his brothers to manage grow a family-owned ventures in the Corpus Christi area. His experience as both as an entrepreneur and a police academy graduate gives him a strong practical understanding of the challenges facing working families and business owners across the state. He and his wife, Victoria, make their home in Corpus Christi, where they are raising their 4 children. Representative Matt Shaheen serves the citizens of District 66 in the Texas House of Representatives. He serves as chairman of the House Committee on Elections and serves as a member on the Committee on Higher Education and the Sunset Advisory Commission. Before serving in the legislature, Mr. Shaheen served 5 years in the Collin County Commissioner's Court. Representative Shaheen is a native of Virginia, where he received his bachelor's degree from Randolph-Macomb College and won all-conference honors in football. He holds a master's degree from SMU. He and his wife, Robin, have been married for 31 years, and they have been blessed with 3 children. Last but not least, James Quintero, my colleague at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So James joined the foundation in 2008, and his work has generally focused on local government matters, especially where it involves taxes, spending, and debt. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, Fox News, and Breitbart. Quintero received his bachelor's from the University of Texas at Austin and his MPA from Texas State University. He's currently seeking his PhD in public policy from Liberty University. And in 2022, he was appointed to serve a 3-year term on the Commission for Lawyer Discipline. James Quintero and his wife, Tricia, are blessed with 5 children and faithfully attend Bannockburn Baptist Church. One thing that's missing in James's bio is the fact that this morning he received the Texas Patriot Excellence Achievement Award. And one thing I will say, at TPPF, I'm known for wearing many hats, but I would not be able to do what I do at TPPF if it weren't for the powerhouse that is James Quintero. So James, let's kick it off with you. Why isn't relief sticking at the local level?
Wow, where do we begin? Okay, so, one of the great frustrations that I sense among the legislators that I interact with, and perhaps that will be echoed today, is that nothing yet has stuck, right? If you go back in time to 2023, the Texas legislature at that time adopted the largest tax relief package in Texas history, and perhaps even according to some in world history, right? It was an $18 billion relief package that later turned out to be somewhere in the range of $22 billion of tax relief, and that should have meaningfully reduced everyone's tax bills in perpetuity, or at least for a long time. And then you fast forward just a few years, and the 2025 Texas legislature is once again wrestling with this challenge of high taxation. And you're thinking, well, darn, what just happened? And so that legislature then passes a $10 billion tax relief package that was intended to reduce everyone's tax bill, depending on whether you're a regular homeowner or an elderly/disabled homeowner, by anywhere between $500 and $1,000, right? And yet here we are again in the middle of 2026 talking about hopefully another round of tax relief. And so we keep going through these cycles where the legislature cuts taxes, and what's happening is your local governments then rush into the gap and they raise taxes, right? And they do so through a lot of different means and mechanisms, like tax rate increases. They have big bond elections. They issue certificates of obligation. And one of the ones that I'm seeing increasingly is they create or expand the duties of special purpose districts, right? So you have a lot of different influences on the process that are eroding state-directed tax relief and putting us in a very bad position as we move into the next legislative session. So my hope is that the legislature will break this cycle, and perhaps we'll get into how we do that, but we're in a bad cycle, and there's very clearly some strong action needed at the state legislative level.
James, let's stay with you. Let's dig a little bit deeper. So what are some of those biggest drivers in terms of spending and debt?
Yeah, so if we zoom back just a little bit and we look at Texas in totality, what we observe is that we've got about 5,500 local governmental entities. Now, most of those are property taxing units. A few of those are sales tax driven taxing units, right? So of the 5,500, about 5,000 are property taxing units. And about half are special purpose districts, and the remainder are schools, cities, and counties. So if we just look at the special purpose districts category, what we notice is that there's been this phenomenon in Texas government where the legislature very often comes in and they create these special taxing units to do a particular job. And that's not a bad thing, right? We have very particular problems, and these SPDs are created to solve that problem. The issue is they create them and then they forget about them. And so what's happened with special districts is you've got one layered upon another, and not only are they forgotten about, but governments tend to grow. And so they spend more, they tend to engage in mission creep, they take on more debt. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is when we look at cities in particular, there is this progressive activism that has taken root. And when you pair progressive activism with home rule authority, what you observe is these governments are growing and spending at rates that are causing a lot of problems on the tax side. So I would, if forced to really drill down the problem, I would say there's too much government and there's too much activity. And we ought to consider some policy reforms to get a hold of both of those.
Chairman Shaheen, let's bring you into the conversation. So from your vantage point at the Capitol, what has been done right, and then what tax reform efforts have fallen short at the legislature?
Yeah, so I mean, James did a really good job articulating the struggle that the legislature goes through. Right, we have done some great things. When I first entered the legislature back in 2015, I mean, your homestead exemption was I think like $15,000, right? And it's like almost 10 times that much if you're 65 or older. It's around $200,000, right? So, and you've probably heard the top three, the governor, lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House has talked about. We have $51 billion into the state budget that's providing tax relief. It's funding those higher homesteads. It's the compression of some of the tax rates and the like. The problem is, I go to back to my district after session, and nobody's holding any kind of parades for me, and nobody's slapping me on the back saying great job on my property taxes. They're not feeling it, and I think that's the piece where we have to start addressing, right? I think we need to start looking at do we implement spending caps? Do we increase the threshold with respect to making it more difficult for local governments to increase taxes? A lot of areas it's just a simple majority, right? Do we make that 2/3 or what have you? Do you actually go to the citizens versus just the taxing entity as well? So I think what we've done is we made a good effort as far as looking at the rates, the homestead exemptions, all those types of things. I think what we need to see now is the state legislature actually putting some restrictions on spending and the like. We put restrictions on ourselves. Our state budget doesn't go above inflation and population rates. We have restrictions on our debt. And that doesn't exist a lot. We have some rollback issues and all those types of things, but we don't have a lot of restrictions on growth of government and debt and the like, and I think, quite frankly, they're taking advantage of it.
Let's bring in the newest chairman of the Texas Senate. So, Chairman Hinojosa, what are you hearing from taxpayers back in your district? Are they actually feeling this relief?
No, and to capitalize on what James and my colleague in the House, Matt Shaheen, has been saying and articulating, we do the best that we can at the state level to try. But first and foremost, people need to understand we do not levy a state property tax. All property tax stays local. And so when you're seeing your property tax bills increase, it's not the state that's increasing your property taxes, as what's discussed. It's your cities, your counties, your ISDs, your MUDs that are out of control in a lot of ways, your special districts. There's so much. So, of course, when skyrocketing appraisal values occur, then politicians like to say, well, we haven't increased the rate. Well, no, you haven't increased the rate, but you also haven't adopted the no new net revenue rate either. So you're seeing the net levy is actually a lot higher, despite our efforts in spending, over $50 billion now to compress and homestead exemptions and everything else that we're trying to do. The net levy for people is still higher, or at least still what it was the year before. So they're not experiencing the savings that we are trying to, give them through our efforts at the state. And that's why we have to have a very strong conversation with regard to what we do to potentially cap or rein in local spending.
So there's a cycle at hand that happens where the state sends down property tax relief, then local governments spend more of your money, and then there's these taxpayer-funded lobbyists who go to the Capitol to advocate against reforms that would cap some of the spending at the local level. And so, James, I want you for a moment to walk us through this cycle, tell us how this actually plays out at the legislature.
Well, that's very good. I've been around long enough to have done battle with pretty much every taxpayer-funded lobbyist at the legislature. But I'll just relay one quick story. Back in 2019, we were working with both chairs in the House and the Senate to advance a measure to lower, at that time it was called the rollback rate. Now it's called the voter approval tax rate. And basically what that mechanism does is it establishes a ceiling. Government, you can raise a rate that produces X number of dollars more, and then if you want to produce more than that, you've got to go ask voters for permission. So it was a good government reform intended to both bring in the public to a greater degree into the rate setting process, right? But also to try and instill some reasonability into how fast taxes were growing. Anyways, so we're trying to advance this measure. This is now our third session trying to get the rollback rate reduced from 8% down to 3.5%. And the dam finally breaks, right? We finally get this bill through the process. But during the course of battle, I recall walking into committee and thinking, darn, there are a lot of people here. And, part of me thinks that, or hopes that at least some of these folks are regular citizens ready to tell government, we want fiscal discipline. Well, unfortunately, what it turned out to be is just a room full of taxpayer-funded lobbyists and local officials, each of whom had a sob story. And it was really unfortunate because it's at that point you recognize that our money has been weaponized against us to maintain the status quo, or in some cases, to expand government and make things worse from a taxpayer perspective. And so, again, fortunately, we were successful in that effort in 19, but it took us 3 sessions. And a part of me wonders, how much better would the average taxpayer be off today were we initially successful back in 2015 and we got that rate lowered? I tend to think most people would at least be a little bit better off because we would have done that reform sooner. So.
Chairman Shaheen, so do you see local governments as how do you see them responding to the state-provided tax relief, or are we seeing local government to work around that relief?
Yeah, that's a nice softball question. They're clear working around it. James, you brought up like a nightmare memory that I had. So I was on Wayne's at Maine's when that happened, and my memory is, so again, we're talking about the rollback, right? So reducing from 8 to 3.5, and they can still increase their spending if they want. They just got to get voter approvals. And I remember the mayor of Austin back then, who wasn't maybe the most brightest individual in the city, but he came and testified that if we reduce the rollback rate, that he would have to cut his police force, right? I mean, it's just silly scare tactics and the like, and God forbid he reduces, rainbow crosswalks and administrative staff and all that kind of stuff. But what we were having to hear all that kind of stuff constantly, and we've got to ban taxpayer-funded lobbying. I know that's a theme throughout here, and we need y'all's help on that. Probably about 24 of those bills are going to be filed, and if y'all can track that and help us and outnumber the lobbyists, right? Because that's their livelihood. But yeah, no, they clearly work around the work that we do. The best job in Texas is a school board trustee. So where I live, I'm up in Collin County. I'm not exaggerating. There are, I think, 3 or 4 football stadiums that cost over $70 million. Right, and their scoreboards are multi-million-dollar, right? And they got these LED lights. I mean, when I played football, right, it was wooden benches that people sat on, right? And I mean, it's unbelievable. So they go around and they do. By the way, the schools have these food courts that are nicer than the mall. I mean, I am not exaggerating. And then they do all that, and then they go around and say, "Dang it, the legislature's underfunding education," even though we literally fund over $100 billion for education. So I'm going to leave the legislature and run for trustee. I mean, that's just the spot to have. Yeah, no, they're obviously navigating, working around that, and that's why a lot of what the governor was talking about when he spoke to all of us a couple nights ago. I think some of the reforms that he's getting out early on are what's going to be helpful. I'm glad he's driving that discussion earlier, but again, increasing the threshold for voter approval for tax increases and debt limits and the like. I really like this discussion about getting rid of the M&O tax rate, right, and just shift the burden onto the state and just remove that piece from property taxes. And I think that's going to be a really interesting dialogue, right? I'll be interested to see later in the year when people start producing numbers and what period of time that takes. I think that'll be an interesting dialogue. But we clearly need those reforms to either pigeonhole or create some field goal post for our local elected officials to work from.
Chairman Hinojosa, so James and Chairman Shaheen both mentioned the practice of taxpayer-funded lobbying. It seems like anytime we see property tax reform stall or get watered down at the legislature, local governments are spending millions of our tax dollars to hire these contract lobbyists to oppose said reforms. Senator Middleton, for session after session, was the key champion in the Senate carrying the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying. So my question to you is very simple. Who's going to carry the torch in the Texas Senate heading into next session?
You're looking at him. Thank you. When I first got there this last session, I joined Senator Middleton right away in co-authoring during the regular session. Then when we had the opportunity again in the special session, we joint authored that bill. Even we're helping on the House side to try to get more participation and support for it. This is the year. We have to get this done. Look, there's no shortage of great solutions to rein this in. We've talked about compressing more on the M&O, but when we're talking about schools, we also need to have a conversation about limiting spending on the INS side, the interest in sinking portion that was meant, and you can fact check me, but I believe it's Article 11, Section 7 of the state constitution that actually created the INS to allow for these big projects like buildings, school buildings and those types of things, but it's never meant for deferred maintenance. It was never meant for additional equipment and supplies and things that are being stuffed into these bonds on top of building these Taj Mahal schools, Right. And so we need to have a conversation about these types of reforms. I filed legislation last session to limit what you could put in your bonds. I filed legislation to cap superintendent salaries that were making more than President of the United States. And basing that off of real incentives, like what their measure is, what their grade is, and the new A through F accountability scores. How much are they paying their teachers? I mean, look, we got lobbied when we passed HB2 to increase much deserved and much needed teacher pay raises. But we were being lobbied to put that money into the basic allotment. And of course, they're all fighting for the basic allotment. What a lot of people don't realize is that basic allotment gives a lot of latitude to ISDs. They could have increased teacher salaries on their own if they wanted to. So we had to actually put that money into a bucket specifically for teacher pay raises. And that's the issue, is that if we give it to, now so there's some great ISDs who do it extremely well, but there's some that we really, need to rein in. And unfortunately, the way it works at the state, we're going to have to really look at, some of those measures. But each and every time that we come up with a great idea and we try to get it through, it's stifled because of taxpayer-funded lobbying. And we have to get rid of that practice.
So, James, let's shift the conversation to what's driving local spending. How much of this is unchecked local spending versus, a flaw in the system?
Well, that's a great question. And I do want to put a bit of a finer point on Chairman Hinojos's observation that superintendent salaries are out of control. This is kind of like a dog whistle for me. I love this issue because, for me at least, it just highlights the excess in the system. The Texas Education Agency every year updates a superintendent salary database, which every year blows my mind. And this year, what they identified is that the top paid superintendent in Texas is Harlandale ISD's superintendent, whose total compensation package reaches $657,000. Now, okay, if you're going to pay somebody $650,000 for a job, they better be doing the best job ever. And yet you look at the academic performance in the district, and to say it's subpar is an understatement. So we are lavishing education administrators with, at least those at the very top, with some very generous compensation packages, and we're not getting the sort of ROI that we ought to. But even more so, I don't believe, even if they were, I would still question, is it appropriate for a public servant to be making a salary of that nature? I think that's an open question, to say the least. So, when we consider, well, why are these things happening? I think one of the very obvious conclusions is that there are a set of fiscal rules in place that govern state finance that are not applicable at the local level. And what I mean is, when you consider the nature of state government, the state's finances are managed by a set of 5 different constitutional and statutory expenditure limits, right? And they govern everything from the growth of general revenue to debt to welfare spending and a few other categories. Now let's go down to the local level. I will readily admit that we have a property tax revenue limitation, and that's a good thing. It has holes in it though, right? And the bad guys have figured out how to navigate around that 3.5% limit. By the way, those holes were put there by taxpayer-funded lobby groups like Texas Municipal League, Texas Association of Counties, and a lot of others. So they intentionally drilled some holes in the limit. Even still, it's there, and it's a good thing. We also have a 50-cent debt limit. Now, this is a limit intended to manage the growth of school district debt. Here again, though, I think there are some obvious holes. And so what I'm trying to communicate is that the state's finances are well managed by a set of relatively strict standards. The local level does not have those standards, those same expenditure standards, and where there are protections in place, they're weak, or at least they could be improved. So my plea to the next legislature is those things that you observe ought to be extended down to the local level. And by imposing some reasonable restraints on spending and debt, then we can start to naturally work out some of the excess in the system. Because if a school district's budget is confined by an expenditure limit that's pegged to population and inflation or enrollment and inflation, then they're going to have to figure out, how do I prioritize these dollars, right? Am I going to pay my superintendent even more than $650,000, or am I going to have to allocate those dollars elsewhere, right? And so I think the solution, or at least part of the solution here, is the adoption of strict fiscal rules and the implementation of those rules down to the local level.
I'm not running for trustee. I want to apply for superintendent.
To piggyback on James's last point, Chairman Shaheen, so we need more guardrails at the local level. There's guardrails such as rollback rates, approval thresholds. Are any of these strong enough, or do we need to ensure we come back next session and go for something stronger?
Clearly the way the discussion's going, we need to strengthen those. Going back to the governor and some of the comments that he's been making in the plan that he's initially thrown out there, some of the things that I like is he's trying to give more power back to our constituents and our citizens. I mean, the senator's right. There's this confusion that the state actually is the entity that is setting the property tax rate and property taxes, but that some of that's our fault, right? Because we're stepping in there, and I think we're actually confusing the voters somewhat. So, like, there's a provision there to where citizens can just petition for a rollback election. They just gather enough signatures, right? And so I think I really like that idea, because again, you're connecting constituents with their local government and the dialogues between those two. He's been talking about appraisal reforms. Maybe we don't do appraisals every year, right? That's a lot of the issue as well, right? We cut taxes, appraisals goes up, and so forth. So again, I think when you want to talk about guardrails, I think my hope is the discussions more along that area. I actually get more, and I'm probably in a minority here, but I'm actually more excited about that than like getting rid of the M&O property tax. I think, again, going back to where the local constituents, local citizens are holding their local government spending and property tax rates accountable, I think getting the dialogue back there, I think will help as far as just the overall property tax burden. But don't quote me, I like the M&O, getting rid of the M&O.
Chairman Hinojosa, staying in the topic of local spending, how do bonds, debt issuance, off-cycle elections, how do all these things factor into our rising property tax burdens?
Yeah, well, I mean, every time, we pass a bond, again, it goes to the INS portion of the school taxes, which I don't think we have enough discussion about regarding that. And we have schools, as what was stated, they're building Taj Mahal schools that are way overbuilding. There's a lot that occurs there. Then you have change orders, you've got, out of control. I've got a city in my district, a small population, I won't call them out specifically, but just passed recently a $60 million bond for a new school with declining enrollment. I mean, make that make sense. That's just ridiculous. And every time that happens, we're on the hook for taking care of that debt. And so, it's something that we definitely need to continue to look at. We fleshed out some ideas along with James, or we had an idea to standardize school buildings. The study is there's 1,207 or so public ISDs, and the study is every 3 to 5 years they build a new school. But why do every time they build a new school, we have to have it re-engineered, redesigned, all the things. And, Taj Mahal schools, stadiums, water parks. There's a water park in my district. I'm like, how in the heck did that get there at a school, right? So why couldn't we do what some very smart conservative cities do with their fire departments? And they have standard plans that are already pre-approved. The permitting process is a lot easier. You get standardized, if you're a 5A school and you need a new elementary school, here's a couple of options already designed, already per spec. We'll leave a little bit of room in there for some customization, some topography differences that are obviously going to occur, but hey, some color, but we have pre-approved materials, go out and bid it. And how many billions of dollars would we save doing something like that, right? But I filed that bill last session, and It was probably taxpayer-funded lobbying that killed it. It didn't even get a committee hearing. So, there's not an end to the number of great ideas, but it is absolutely true that we have to do something because we are not seeing those savings at the local level, despite our continued effort to try to compress homestead exemption. I want to say one other thing, too, because we talk a lot about homestead exemptions. And I'm all for that. I'm all for, I think, we need to find a pathway to eventually eliminate property taxes from our homes. We should never be leveraging our homesteads to pay for, all the things that we should be taking care of already. But we always leave out of the conversation commercial real estate, all property. It has to be across the board. We have a lot of commercial property that are taking the weight every time we do exemptions in other places. So we have to take care of our commercial property owners as well, and they need relief. Their appraised values skyrocket tremendously. Hoteliers who, their model is, a place like this, you've got big walkways. They can't lease those areas, but it's necessary for their business model. So a hotel in South Padre may be making $10 million a year. Their property taxes are outrageous compared to, a doctor's office who can lease a space in a shopping center and make $10 million of revenue is a lot lower property tax obligation. And I'm no way advocating for more property taxes for the doctor's office. What I'm saying is that we've got to do something for our commercial property owners, and it's got to be across the board. We cannot leave them out of the discussion.
Let's talk about solutions. So, Chairman Shaheen, if you had to prioritize 1 to 2 tax reform priorities that would ensure that taxpayers actually see that relief, what would those be?
Yeah, I mentioned one of them before as far as being able to petition for lower property taxes, but I think clearly the concept around spending limits, we've got to implement those. It's almost like we're throwing money at the problem a little bit. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but we're going to continue to do our parts, but I think the spending limits is going to be huge, right? So again, that's going to voters for approval for property tax increases, increasing the threshold to maybe 2/3 or what have you. It's going to be those types of items, those additional guardrails that are going to be great. But it's going to be easier to say that than to do that, because here's what's going to happen. You all heard what catastrophic results were going to be on our public school system if we pass school choice, right? You're going to hear 10 times that when we start talking about bigger thresholds for voter approvals and spending limits and the like. Remember the example I told you where the Austin mayor said he was going to have to reduce his police force? We're going to hear that like over and over and over again. So we need to be prepared. I'd like to think that we can work on that collectively. The governor is going to do his part. He spent a lot of his capital will on school choice, got that across the goal line. I think here there's going to be a lot of unanimity as far as property tax relief. I think everybody wants to be property tax relief, right? So I think where we're going to get hit is your mayors and your city council and your trustees and your commissioners court and the like. And I think the more that the discussion doesn't stop here, but it continues, and there's that awareness. And when you go back to your homes and your counties and what have you, right, the dialogue doesn't stop, because this is going to take all of us. Because that picture of walking into a committee room and there's a bunch of taxpayer lobbyists, that's going to happen in spades.
Staying on the topic of solutions, Chairman Hinojosa, so what is realistic next session? And what are some of those items where we can build momentum?
Well, I know with the help of a lot of great people, including yourselves, the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying, as my colleague just said, that's a big thing as to why a lot of our great ideas are not moved forward. So it's both of those have to work in tandem, and I think we're getting a lot of momentum on both those issues. But in additional, what is reasonable, obviously we'll stand up here and we'll say, we'd love to completely eliminate property tax. Is that reasonable next session? No. So we have to start working our way there. Capping, like what was discussed. What is the actual rate? How do cities, determine what, some go by the inflation number. A lot of businesses like to use CPI. The main point is predictability. I think if we can get to a point of predictability, especially for our commercial folks. So, well, even our homeowners too. I mean, we need to know if we're buying this home today, in 10 years, can I still afford to live there? Or commercial, if I'm going to make a huge investment in building or buying a building and renovating, am I going to be able to still do business 10 or 20 years from now based on the tax rate? Well, if we have predictability and we know at max how much that's going to increase and capping it at the lowest possible number we can possibly find at this point, that gives us the predictability to be able to move forward. I think all of those are reasonable solutions. We've talked about some other great ideas. All of that is very reasonable. I don't see any reason why we can't get all that passed, but we have to get through lobbies.
So James, you've written extensively about local spending. What are some of those, or what can fundamentally be done at the local level in order to reform the system?
Great question. So let's first recognize that each government is both undergirded by its own unique political philosophy and has its own particular duties. Which is to say, when you think about the universe of broad reforms, it's kind of difficult, right? Each one probably needs a special treatment in some way. And so how do we get at this issue? Well, one thing that we've considered in the past is the institution of a third-party efficiency audit, right? Our ask is that the legislature require cities, counties, school districts, and maybe even special districts to voluntarily undergo an objective and thorough analysis of their budget and operations for the purpose of identifying waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Each entity ought to undergo this type of analysis, but if we want to bring it even more current, one of the, I think, urgent considerations that ought to be made is we should recognize that we live in a unique period, meaning that when COVID came about, Congress flooded Texas state and local governments with a lot of temporary monies, right? And there's a sticky quality to these monies that is actually noted in the economics literature. It's referred to as the flypaper effect. And that what the flypaper effect refers to is this kind of this tendency for one-time or temporary federal aid to invite lasting change to those recipient governments, because as we all know, governments hate to part ways with people and programs. And so we find ourselves now on the other side of this largesse, this federal largesse that's happened. And I suspect we have a lot of local governments in Texas that have attempted to retain some portion of those federally initiated people and programs, and they've tried to continue those things in part by raising taxes, right? Now, it's not just tax increases. One of the other interesting bits that you can find in the literature is that anytime governments become subject to a property tax limitation of sorts, what they'll do is they'll seek out monies to maintain their expenditure base through other means. And what does that generally entail? Well, federal aid, state aid, fees, fines, anywhere else they can find money, they will go and find those monies. And so, you know, perhaps in addition to an audit requirement, we ought to, again, consider an expenditure limit. And then I'm going to throw this third one in because, you know, what we've seen a lot is there's been this shift towards debt. And I think that's done in part to evade the property tax revenue limit. If we're going to have this shift toward debt and not impose a strict debt limit, then we need maximum transparency. And so when voters go to say yes or no on these big, giant billion-dollar bonds, right next to that proposition, there ought to be a cost estimate. You want to borrow X number of dollars, well, you ought to tell me how much is that going to increase my taxes, either on a monthly or annual basis, right? We've made some headway on that issue by requiring now that the political subdivisions state in bold capital letters, this is a tax increase, but we need to take that further. We need to tell folks, this is the actual tax impact that the average homeowner should expect. So those three things.
James, let's stay with you. So I'm here to make an announcement. So TPPF, in partnership with the America First Policy Institute, has developed this economic model to help us better understand the costs and effects of various property tax relief proposals. So James, what will this model allow lawmakers, taxpayers to better understand about our property tax system?
Well, thank you for the question. And yes, we've been working with our friends and partners at AFPI, along with some other contract PhDs, to develop an economics model with the intent of objectively analyzing various property tax proposals. And the goal is to be able to say, if you want to go down route A, here are the costs and the benefits. If you want to go down route B, here are the costs and the benefits, et cetera. And so we are actually finalizing all the particulars around that model and hope to debut it soon. We're sharing that information with some friends at the legislature, I believe as early as next week, perhaps more to come on that. But again, the goal of this effort is to begin to objectively analyze the advantages and or disadvantages of any particular proposal and help inform, the debate as these guys really launch into things.
So I'm about to ask a final question of our panelists and start prepping those questions for Q&A portion of the program. So gentlemen, what's something or multiple things that maybe you wish would have been said during this conversation that we didn't say? And Chairman Shaheen, I'll start with you.
I'm going to go back to the help we're going to need. In other words, what are we going to do after this? There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of ideas that have been floated around. I think everybody in this room understand that we're going to go through this legislative process, right? And the discussion about the M&O rate and how many years will it take, or how many sessions will it actually take to get that down to zero and the like. All that's going to be worked out. What I'm really focused on and concerned about is the blowback that we're going to get, again, from the mayor, city council. And I mean, it's something I touched on, but that's going to be the force that's going to be against us, against the property tax relief. So I think the more that we can talk about what are we doing leaving here, I think for the next several months and early part of sessions, we're going to, the House and Senate will negotiate different solutions and the like. But what do we do leaving here to make sure that the constituency here and your friends and neighbors back home are coming down to Austin and battling out with the taxpayer-funded lobbying and the like? Because again, I'm telling you, they're going to throw all kind of disasters at it. I had a school superintendent said that they were going to have to cut their football program if we passed school choice. He tweeted it out, right? One of them said they weren't going to have money for air conditioning. I mean, give me a break, right? I mean, those are the two things in Texas you can't live without, football and air conditioning, right? So anyhow, that's coming. I think the more that we're prepared and we can have a discussion about that and plan about how we together fight against those forces, because we see it every day. The lobbyists don't really like us. Like, I know y'all hear about like the dinners and all that kind of stuff. Like, I'm home every night, like at 9 o'clock, talking to my wife, right? I don't get invited to those things, but some people do, and the like. So,
Chairman has that same question.
Well, I think I would just piggyback off of what was being said. We need to come as legislators and we need to work out and be on the same page, I think, because we need to have a unified message going forward. The less that we have to, try to sell to the public, the more that debate and, obstruction we're going to have. So we really need to be on the same page. We need to really work through this in the interim, I think, and pull all ideas together. I think there's a lot of great ideas as what was spoken. We need to do all the things that we can, but we need to be united in that effort. We need all the help from our local citizens and constituents and from researchers and everybody on board to help us. It's going to be a big lift. We know that, but it's so important to know and try to drill down on the roots of the problems and have really meaningful conversations on how to fix those issues. As I think if we do that and approach it in that manner, I think and educate our constituents, I think we have a lot better shot at this.
James, bring us home.
So I'm really encouraged by what the governor and the lieutenant governor have put forward. I think there's a lot to appreciate in both plans. Let me just highlight one thing that really excites me about the governor's plan in particular, though, and that's the rollback reduction elections. Now, if I could humbly suggest that we work on the name, I think a tax cut election concept is far better to articulate. But basically what the proposal calls for is empowering the electorate to be able to call for tax cut elections, right? And why does this matter? Well, when you consider how many different ways local governments can ask the public to raise taxes, there's a lot of different ways, whether that's voter approval tax rate elections, tax ratification elections, bond elections, sales tax reauthorization elections. I mean, you go on down the list and they've got a menu of different options to raise your taxes. The only real mechanism by which voters can get less taxes, though, is to elect the right people. And that has not worked out, and I would suggest in part because the taxpayer-funded lobbyists have built a progressive infrastructure that tends to grab newly electeds and drag them in a leftward direction, right? But that's separate and apart. TASB, TASB. So what I really find really encouraging about this proposal is we would potentially be decentralizing the tax relief process, right? We wouldn't always look to the legislature to cut our taxes. We would actually have some of that power and authority ourselves, and we would be able to either get those taxes cut through referendum and initiative, or bang the drum so loudly that the governing body themselves lowers the burden, right? And so I think initiatives like that, where we are empowering the electorate with the ability to force lower taxes, is something to be excited about.
And with that, we're going to switch over to questions from the audience. Rafa's walking around with a mic, and let's go to this gentleman right here, Mr. John Wood.
Yes. I have the pleasure, there we go, just me. I have the pleasure of serving on a Central Appraisal District board. We took control of the board because the board was like the team of 8. They always followed the assessor, the appraiser. But we got a surprise. We changed the appraisal schedule to give people a bit more breathing room. We lengthened it to 3 years instead of every year and saved the county money. But in the second year, we used extrapolation to get any changes in the appraisal on every class of building, houses, commercial buildings, things like that. So we get notice from the state that we missed their numbers, which they get by looking at 10% of our appraisals, and said, you're in error. If you do it again, we're going to take money from the schools because it's a rural county, and they need the schools need the money. I mean, there's not very many people there and a lot of space, whereas the cities have tons of people in a tight space and they get tons of money, the Robin Hood loan. So I go to my appraiser and say, well, what happened, buddy? And he said, well, the state uses this 10% to give us a number, but we don't get to know it until they say we missed their number with our appraisal, and your school district's money, the money that they would get is at risk because you underappraised. Now, I agree with everything you've said, but there's a sticky little thing that Austin's doing to rural counties and low-income counties where it's guess the number. And if we don't guess right, then we get penalties for something we didn't even know that we did wrong. And I just wanted to bring that out in public because it caused us great distress. And when explained to me, it caused me more distress. Also, boo, team of 8.
Questions? Michael.
May I just respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead and address.
That's not the first time I've heard that, sir. Did that letter come from the comptroller's office? Of course. Okay. So I've heard that too. I haven't addressed that yet because we're digging into finding out why that is. Is that state law that's requiring them to do that, or is that just the office doing it? I don't know the answer to that just yet, and we're drilling down on that. It's not the first time I've heard that, and where there is an issue in my district regarding that same scenario. So we're being told there are chief appraisers, or of course we know that they're supposed to be within 95 to 105%, excuse me, of the value. But what role is that? We're lawmakers. Is that something we need to look at?
We got rid of our appraiser because we didn't trust him. We got an appraiser that we really trust explicitly. And he comes like with his face, long and says, "Oh no." So, the appraisal board, part of us are elected by the taxpayers, and the other part are elected by the taxing entities. And I got invited, amazingly, elected by the taxing entities, and the school districts were just, "Wah!" Okay. Of course, they overreact every time somebody takes a nickel from them, but they had a case there.
Yeah, let me just wonder aloud that the PBS has assumed a place of importance because of the entanglement between state and local finance when you're in the school district budgeting context, right? I mean, there's so much, and so I think this is why the state tends to have this sort of concept in place. And I wonder if we continue down the path of rate compression and we eliminate the M&O entirely, and perhaps even get to work on INS at some distant point in the future, right? If we take that issue off the table, how important then is the PBS? I think probably not as much.
Not directly driving at that point, but that's a road to go.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so, and I don't know the answer to this, that's why I'm asking the question. Let's focus on the school boards and the counties and the cities. All these special purpose districts, are they serving their special purpose? And do they need to be more closely looked at, or are they actually doing their jobs?
So a lot of times you'll have like we'll call them a MUD and the like. And what their purpose is, if you're in this location where there's desire to have a development, but you're not in the jurisdiction of a city and you're out in the county and the dollars aren't there for the immediate infrastructure, right? And so the concept is you have this MUD, this utility district that has a tax rate that's collecting property taxes to fund the sewage, the roads, and all that kind of stuff. Because again, they're outside the city, so you don't have those dollars for the infrastructure. The problem is, somebody made the comment earlier, is like, you get the infrastructure in place and all that kind of stuff, but now you have these people that have this taxing authority and they kind of don't like to get rid of it and they continue taxing, right? So that's the answer to your question. So the concept was they were always supposed to be temporary, but I mean, we have bills that come to the legislature that not only are the MUDs not going away, but now they want their own police force and all that kind of stuff, and they're really supposed to be working. If it's out in the unincorporated area, they're really supposed to be relying on the sheriff. And obviously, if they end up being annexed by a city, then the city obviously should do the police force. So anyhow, all that to say, there are some additional no, I don't know how new they are, but they have these things called MMDs, municipal management districts, and it's all fixed, right? So there's this one bill, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but there's this one bill, get the infrastructure paid, everybody pays a flat rate over a period of time, and then once you've paid it, it's done and it's gone. So I think we need to do more of that kind of concept. But that's what those are developed for.
And if I could just piggyback off the chairman, because he's right. When you think about special purpose districts, what I would do is break it in two, right? You've got an infrastructure related category, and I'd put MUDs in that bucket, where these are intended to provide, water, wastewater, et cetera, over a long period. And these are public services that I think we can all agree we need. And then in the other bucket, I would put service-oriented special districts. And an example of this is like a crime control district, right? A crime control district is created because there's an excess amount of crime in a particular area. Well, that may be true at one point, but as you move forward and an area gentrifies or something else changes, that may not be true at some point in the future. Right now, there is no mechanism by which to come and analyze, is that district still needed? Now, let me suggest, we have a sunset commission at the state level to review state agencies. We ought to take that model and apply it down to special districts, where we're now looking at service-oriented special districts and figuring out, do we still need them? Can their services be assumed by another governmental entity? Have they engaged in mission creep, right? We ought to be engaged in some sort of holistic review process where we're looking at those things.
Questions? Right over here.
So we know the power that TML has, and yet they're supposed to be training and teaching our city and our county elected officials. Is there anything that we can do other than trying to get it through taxpayer-funded lobbying to restrict them from, coming against us, the taxpayers? They're teaching the city and county officials how to raise our taxes.
I think the best thing, I want to be a little careful. They're like this I know we're not big fans in this room, right? But they're their own independent association, and so I'm a little hesitant for the state to step in and do something about them per se. But I think what we could do, or what y'all could do, is have an alternative. So I know there's a group of individuals, for example, that are trying to create an alternative to TASB, and they're even taking it to the point where they provide like insurance services and all that kind of stuff. Because some of these, like Conference of Urban Counties, will provide the counties like IT infrastructure and some software solutions and the like. So anyhow, I think probably the answer to your question is to have some alternatives that don't do the brainwashing and the like. And I know TML actually teaches that it's a bad thing not to be unanimous on their votes, for example, which is awful. But anyhow, I think that might be the best approach. I mean, that's kind of my opinion on it.
I don't disagree with my colleague over here at all, but I will just point out, and we try to allow for local control as much as possible. But I'll take a line from your other colleague, or my other House colleague, Representative Troxclair, yesterday in her session when she was talking about, the ultimate local control, though, is our individual freedom. And so if that is not, and we, as state senators, as state reps, we have the same constituency as our locals. And if our constituents are asking us for relief and our locals are not doing it, what has to be understood is the power lies in the state. The state is who created the federal government. The state is who created the local governments. So the power lies in the states. And if we have to step in and do something, we should, if we need to. But I think it's better for them to do it on their own. I think there's ways that we can take more responsibility, and I'm going to do that myself as I'm carrying a bill to ban taxpayer-funded lobbying, which is not going to be popular with my municipalities, nor are these tax cuts. But you know what? It's incumbent upon me to go to my cities, explain to them, because a lot of them have misinformation. That is the model of taxpayer-funded lobbying. They're going to, tell you the bill that we had on the table last session. Good friends of mine, become really dear friends of mine who sit on county commissioners' courts or city elected, city councils, telling me the misinformation. I'm saying, no, that's not what this bill does. You still have, the ability to do the bill scrubbing, and you still can have, go to the services and get the continuing education and all the things. So they were being lied to. So it's incumbent upon us to also educate our locals. And I know it's more than what we probably are supposed to do, but it's something that we should do. And I'm going to make that effort and that commitment to go around to my local municipalities and explain what my bill does and making sure they understand it fully and helping in that way. I think that education, and we have wonderful relationships with my cities and counties, and they all have my cell phone number. So that's my compelling reason as to why you don't need any other lobbyists. You've got me already, right? So just call me direct. And in that way, I think I should be present to be able to explain that a little further to them. And I think that's going to go a long way.
Let me just quickly add, Senator Middleton had a really interesting idea that we tried to help shepherd through the process, and this would be to amend the Texas Public Information Act to allow for the public to submit requests to associations, right? Nonprofit statewide associations. And the justification is if you're a group like TML, you largely subsist on public monies. Now you're getting it from the government, presumably in exchange for services, but that's still public monies. And so if you're going to be an entity that is almost entirely operated on public funding, then the public ought to understand what you're doing with their money. And so I hope that proposal comes back in the next session, because that's a really good idea to empower the public to ask questions about how their tax dollars are being used.
Questions, David?
I'm following that bill.
I know you mentioned it very briefly at the beginning, but I'd like you to speak to certificates of obligation and P3 agreements, and what was their original purpose and how has that transformed into something that we don't like?
So every year, the Bond Review Board releases some really great detail. It's called the Local Government Annual Report. You can find that information, I believe, as of January of this year. It's current. What BRB shows is that CO debt is on the rise. And in fact, there's one jurisdiction in particular that has more than $1 billion in CO debt outstanding now. I should probably explain. Certificates of obligation permit cities and counties mainly to go into debt without voter permission, right? And you ask, well, why would they want to do that? Well, sometimes it's for legitimate reasons, like a hurricane blows through town and they don't have time to hold an election and to fix the roads. Got it. But increasingly what they're doing is they're taking controversial things that might cause a ruckus during an election and using COs to fund them, right? And so I can probably cite to you a few different examples. One of my favorites, though, is this big, giant 30-foot silver face that Bexar County attempted to build about 10 years ago. And I believe it was called Plethora, so you can fact check me on this, right? Plethora was a $750,000 monstrosity that they were going to place in the middle of a park. Well, one, that should have gone to voters. Two, it should have never been funded anyway. But three, they ran into trouble because it turns out Plethora was going to cost almost double that initial estimate. So they didn't even get the statue fully funded and built. They had some halfway done thing for a long time. And so, that's just one illustration of how COs could potentially be abused. Our preference is to eliminate COs entirely. I think there's enough cause to say, look, if you want to go into debt, you can just go get voter permission. In the absence of that, there's a lot of really good restrictions that ought to be considered to both narrow the use and also allow for much greater public participation, right? The public ought to be notified, hey, I'm gonna do this thing, be given ample time to participate and give feedback in the process, and then some lower threshold established so that if they want to challenge the CO issuance, they can do so. There's a process in place right now, but it's kind of hard to engage in. We need to fix that.
Questions? Let's go right over here.
Question for James, but following up on what the representative said about educating local leaders, an option for local reform is zero-based budgeting. And you know that San Antonio was looking at it, and I'm not sure if they were successful or not, but we've worked on this for many years, and we've been able to get many of our local elected officials on board, but they'll go back to their administrators and officials, which is a separate TML TASA discussion for another time, and they'll come back and say, well, we can't do that. And so we kind of need help having some sort of hand-holding guidebook about how to help elected officials figure out how to implement and encourage their administrators to do zero-based budgeting.
Yeah, what a great thought. And let me shout out San Antonio Council member Mark White, who recently shepherded through I believe it was an ordinance or a resolution requiring the city of San Antonio to begin undergoing zero-based budgeting beginning in fiscal year 2027. So that action can be taken locally, and hopefully we'll see the fruits of that soon. In the past, the legislature has considered measures to require political subdivisions to periodically undergo zero-based budgeting. I think that takes on added urgency today, again, because we're on the other side of a big flood of federal dollars, and now a lot of our local budgets are messed up and bigger than they ought to be. We need some external force to say, hey, look at your books and find the waste, fraud, and abuse so that the pressure on the tax side kind of abates a little bit. As for any materials, please just feel free to send them my way, and I'll be sure to do what I can to help them through the process.
If I may just add, I'm a huge fan of zero-based budgeting. I filed legislation last session so that we could do it here at the state level. But, you know, at least this next session, we're going to try to at least get it started on the Sunset Committee. So all those agencies coming before the Sunset Committee, hopefully we can try to at least get them to be doing zero-based budgeting. But that's a great, great tool. The cities have done that who do that are extremely more efficient. I think we should be doing it here at the state as well.
Excellent. We have time for a final question.
Hi, I want to concur with Senator Hinojosa's statement that our superintendents should not be making more than our U.S. president. But what I've discovered in multiple school districts, in my district, in SD9, is that these superintendent contracts have specific language in addition to their merit-based raises, that any raise that the teachers get, they get. And even though our legislators have wisely excluded superintendents in the language of the bills, can we stop this practice either in saying that the language of this bill supersedes any separate local contracts, or stop local school districts from the ability? This is in addition to their merit-based raises already written in their superintendent contracts. So all of these hard-working teachers that are getting these raises they deserve, the superintendents are getting the same percentage in addition to the raises already built into their contracts. We really need to stop that practice.
I will co-author that bill when you get to the Senate.
Excellent. So that wraps up our panel discussion. It's obvious based on this conversation and what we've heard from the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker over the last 3 days that property tax reform is going to be the defining issue next session. So I encourage you to stay engaged in the legislative process. One last bit of business. I've been told that the police officers are going to come in and sweep the room ahead of the keynote discussion for lunch. So they've asked us to promptly leave the room. Thanks so much.